It was a gray and quiet afternoon in Maple Ridge, the kind that pressed a hush over the town like a heavy wool blanket. James Whitaker trudged down the cracked sidewalk with 2 paper grocery bags in his hands, his steps slow, his eyes heavy with the same wariness he carried every day. He had once been a man full of laughter and life, a skilled carpenter who built playhouses and garden trellises for neighborhood kids. But after the tragic loss of his pregnant wife 3 years ago, James had shrunk into a shell of himself. He moved through life like a ghost in his own story. Polite but distant, kind but unreachable. The town had long stopped trying to pull him back in. As James passed the rusted fence of Rosewood Orphanage, a place he had walked by countless times, he heard something faint. A whisper, barely louder than the breeze, made him pause. He turned and spotted a little girl pressed against the bars of the fence, her face small and pale under a mop of tangled brown hair. She looked about 7, her clothes 2 sizes too big, her sneakers worn thin. Her wide eyes were fixed on him, unsure but hopeful. "Sir," she said again, her voice trembling, "could you pretend to be my daddy? Just for one day." The James blinked, sure he had misheard her. "What?" She stepped back slightly, as if afraid she'd said too much. "Tomorrow is Daddy Day. At the orphanage. All the other kids have someone coming. I don't. Miss Arla says I'll just stay in the back again." She hesitated, then added, "I just thought, maybe you could pretend. Just once." But James stood there, stunned. He had no idea who this child was or why she had chosen him of all people. But her eyes were hauntingly familiar. Not in identity, but in emotion. Loneliness. Longing. The very same look he saw in his own reflection far too often. He looked up at the worn brick building, then back at her. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lottie," she whispered, clutching a threadbare doll close to her chest. He hesitated, part of him screaming to walk away. But something deeper, buried beneath layers of grief, tugged at him. Maybe it was the way her voice cracked when she said Gain, or how she never asked for anything more than one day. "I'll come," James said slowly. "Tomorrow. I'll be your daddy, just for the day." Her face lit up like a sunrise bursting through winter fog. She didn't say thank you, didn't need to. Her expression said everything. As he continued walking home, James realized his hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of purpose. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. Something inside him had just shifted. The morning sun peeked through the clouds as James Whitaker stood outside the wrought iron gates of Rosewood Orphanage, heart pounding harder than he cared to admit, dressed in his best, though still modest, button-down shirt and freshly washed jeans. He clutched a small brown paper bag, filled with homemade cookies and a tiny wooden charm he had carved late the night before. Sleep had been elusive, his mind spinning with doubts. What was he doing here? He hadn't been around children in years, and the last time he had held a toy in his hand, it was meant for a baby who never got the chance to be born. Yet here he was, drawn back by a little girl's whispered plea. As he stepped through the front door, the sound of laughter and excited chatter filled the hall. Colorful streamers lined the walls, and paper hearts hung from the ceiling with words like, "My hero" and "Best dad ever." Children darted about, some hugging visiting men, others showing off their handmade cards. But in the back of the room, alone on a bench with her knees pulled to her chest, sat Lottie. She stared at the floor, her doll cradled in her lap, like she was bracing for disappointment. Then she saw him. Her face lit up, transforming her small frame into a beacon of joy. She jumped up and ran across the room, flinging her arms around James's waist. "You came," she cried, squeezing him tightly. James smiled, surprised at how natural it felt to kneel down and return the hug. "Of course I came. I told you I would." Miss Arla, the orphanage director, raised an eyebrow from across the room, but said nothing. James took Lottie's hand, and together they wandered from activity to activity. They painted a picture of a tree with both of their handprints forming the leaves, built a simple birdhouse, and shared peanut butter sandwiches under the old elm in the courtyard. Lottie introduced him to everyone as her daddy, pride glowing in her voice. And though he reminded himself it was pretend, something about the way she looked up at him, eyes full of admiration, made it feel heartbreakingly real. By the end of the day, James found himself sitting beside her on the orphanage's back steps, watching the other children go back inside. Lottie rested her head against his shoulder, quiet now, content. "Thank you," she whispered. "That was the best day of my life." James swallowed hard. His throat was tight, and something deep inside him cracked open. "I'm glad," he said, barely above a whisper. As he walked home that evening, the lonely silence that usually greeted him felt even heavier than before. Because for the first time in a long while, James wasn't afraid of the memories, but of the unfamiliar feeling blooming in his chest, the fragile beginning of love and a longing to return. James hadn't intended to go back. That's what he told himself as he paced his small living room the following weekend. But by Saturday morning, he found himself standing at the gate of Rosewood Orphanage again, a bag of freshly baked muffins in one hand, and a tiny carved wooden ladybug in the other. Lottie had mentioned she liked them, her eyes lighting up at the memory of finding one on a leaf. That image, so simple, so pure, had stayed with him all week. He had replayed their day together in his mind more times than he could count, and each time, it chipped away at the hardened wall he'd built around his heart. He told himself he was just visiting, just checking in. But deep down, he knew it was more. Lottie ran to him the moment he stepped through the door, her arms flying around his middle, like she'd been waiting all her life. "You came back," she shouted, joy bursting from her voice. "I brought you something," he said with a shy smile, handing her the ladybug. Her fingers curled around it like it was made of gold. "I'm going to keep this forever." Over the next few weeks, James returned again and again. What started as weekly visits became more frequent, sometimes just to drop off a new book or help repair something around the old building. He fixed the creaky front steps, built new shelves for the playroom, and even taught a few of the older kids how to use a hammer properly. But no matter what he did, his time always ended with Lottie, sitting under the elm tree, reading, laughing, or simply holding hands in comfortable silence. One quiet afternoon, as the two sat on a blanket under that tree, Lottie looked up at him, her eyes soft and serious. "Do you think," she asked, almost timidly, "you could be my real daddy someday? Not just pretend?" The question hit James like a thunderclap. His breath caught. He hadn't let himself think that far ahead, not consciously. He was still haunted by the nursery he never got to finish, the crib that was dismantled and stored away after his wife's passing. But Lottie's voice, so hopeful yet cautious, made something stir in him, a longing that had once been buried beneath loss. "I'm not sure I'd be good at it," he said honestly. "I lost my baby once. I was going to be a dad, but then I didn't get the chance." Lottie gently placed her small hand over his. "But you came back for me. You remember what I like. You laugh with me. That means you're already good at it." The tears burned behind his eyes, and he couldn't speak for a long moment. She had no idea the gift she had just given him, the permission to try again. In that moment, James realized something profound. She hadn't just needed a father, he needed a daughter. The adoption process was far more complicated than James had imagined, filled with background checks, interviews, home inspections, and paperwork that never seemed to end. Yet not once did he think of quitting. Every time he felt overwhelmed, he would glance at the drawing Lottie gave him, a crayon picture of the two of them, holding hands under a giant tree with a smiling sun above. At the bottom she had written in crooked letters, "Me and Daddy." That drawing stayed on his refrigerator, a daily reminder of why he was doing this. Miss Arla had been surprised at first but supportive. She had seen many visitors come and go, but never had she seen a man like James show up without fail, week after week, never making promises he couldn't keep. Her heart quietly hoped he would be the one to finally give Lottie the home she deserved. Lottie, for her part, tried to hide her excitement as best as a child could. She asked every few days if the grown-up people had made a decision yet, and James would always kneel beside her and say, "Almost there, sweetheart." Just a little longer. But the weight was wearing on them both. Then one crisp afternoon, James received the call. The adoption had been approved. All the requirements were met. Lottie could come home. With his heart pounding and hands shaking, James drove to Rosewood Orphanage one last time. He was greeted at the door by Miss Arla, who didn't try to hide the tears in her eyes. "She's in the garden," she whispered. "She doesn't know yet." James found Lottie crouched near the bushes, watching a trail of ants with fascination. He cleared his throat gently, and she looked up, smiling wide when she saw him. "Hey, kiddo," he said, kneeling down beside her. "I've got something for you." From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small wooden locket he had carved, shaped like a heart. Inside was a photo of them from Daddy Day, slightly wrinkled but full of joy. "I came to ask you something," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Would you like to come home with me? Not just for a day, for every day." Lottie's hands flew to her mouth, and tears welled in her eyes. "You mean really? Like forever?" James nodded, his own voice breaking. "Forever." She launched herself into his arms, sobbing into his shoulder, repeating, "Yes," again and again. The garden blurred around them as staff peeked out from the windows, some wiping their eyes. It was the moment everyone had quietly wished for, but hadn't dared to expect. That evening, James carried Lottie's small suitcase to the truck, her tiny hand never leaving his. As they drove away from Rosewood, Lottie turned to him and asked, "You're not pretending anymore, right?" James smiled and squeezed her hand. "No, sweetheart. This is real. I'm your dad. Always."